This is the Voice of Russia. The London Bureau of the Voice of Russia is now live on digital radio and online, with news, comment and debate on weekdays between 4 and 7 p.m.
You're listening to the Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm asking, should television cameras be allowed to film in court? The practice is common in the United States, and many people expect that in this year's Queen's speech it will be announced that the sentencing of serious offenders in England and Wales will be televised. Filming in English courts has been banned since 1925, but this ban is expected to be lifted to aid the concept of open justice and allow the public to engage with the justice system. The government has said that filming would improve transparency and public understanding of the courts. Last Wednesday, the life sentencing of the murderer David Gilroy was filmed in Scotland's High Court in Edinburgh, after all the parties involved gave their consent. However, it's believed that broadcasts will be strictly limited, with only the sentencing and judges summing up at the end of the cases being televised. I'm joined in the studio today by Robert Brown, a partner at the law firm Corker Binning, Colin Wells, a criminal defence specialist at 25 Bedford Row, Priscilla Coleman, who's been ITN's court artist for the past 25 years and is one of only 3 in the country. And joining me on the phone from Sydney is Mark Stevens, a media lawyer and partner at the FSI law firm. And on Skype is David Banks, a media law trainer and co-author of the 18th, 19th and 20th editions of the book McNay's Essential Law for Journalists. Thank you all for coming. Now, I'd first like to ask you all very briefly, should television cameras be allowed to film in court? Robert?
Very briefly, the answer is yes, because the technology is there and it's good that people can see what's going on in courts. But a big caveat, what will be allowed to be filmed will be so limited that it's not going to create a revolution in understanding of the justice system.
Colin?
Can I agree with that? As a fellow lawyer, open justice is to be encouraged for all. As an educational tool, it's of great public interest that the general public sees what's actually going on, so there's transparency in proceedings, whether they be civil or probably more of interest, criminal as well. But as Robert said, the actual proceedings that are covered will be of such limited extent to protect the right to a fair trial. So that would be my initial reaction.
Priscilla?
Well, I think something a little bit probably odd for me. I think you might as well go all the way and televise all the court cases. Because in a way, if you choose one, it's making that court case the star, meaning you maybe think the other court cases are not as important. And you can do a whole war just with mobile phones now. So I think just let everything be open, and if the judge hears it and sees it, then the jury should hear it and see it. And I think that should include the legal argument that the jurors are usually sent out for. Now, I suppose lawyers wouldn't agree with that, but a lot of times when and journalists sit in and hear all the extra things they're talking about, you think, why not just trust the jury completely and say, treat them the way the judge does, open it all up.
Mark?
Well, I think that our 2 lawyers are showing typical British reserve, if I may say. I think that I started off in the same position. Being a lawyer, I was showing typical British reserve. But then I did some research on the subject and actually discovered that we in the United Kingdom or in fact in England and Wales, are significantly behind the rest of the world. If you go to other parts of the Commonwealth, for example, India, Australia, New Zealand, they allow cameras into the courtroom. In Canada, it's being increasingly opened up. And of course, our near neighbours in continental Europe, in France, in Germany, and so on and so forth, allow it. So, in fact, in Britain, by not allowing cameras into the courtroom or electronic coverage of courtrooms, so that that would include the not only radio and television, but also perhaps transcripts coming up live, we are, in fact, the odd man out, and we're a little bit behind the curve. And I think that we have to remember the thing that everybody wants is fair trials. They want justice at the end of the day. The most important thing is justice.
And David Banks?
Yes, I mean, like your fellow guests, I think anything which opens up the courts to greater scrutiny and greater publicity, I think, has got to be welcomed, and making the public more aware of what's going on in the courts. But like Priscilla, I share the concern that what will happen is that the conventional mainstream broadcasters will pick and choose their cases, and it will only be the very, very newsworthy cases that get televised publicity, whereas the vast majority of cases will go unreported. I think one of my great regrets is that the regional media, regional press, have withdrawn from court reporting to a great extent. And sadly, I don't think that allowing the cameras into courts is going to replace that coverage. And so people will still be in the dark a little bit about what goes on in courts as a result.
One of the issues here, though, is that we have a situation at the moment where we've got to open up courtrooms, I think, and of course, even if you look at the print media coverage of courtrooms today, it's only the sort of more sensational and the major trials which are getting coverage. And the reason for that is, exactly as David Banks says, it's the limited resources which news organizations now have. So in the same way that editorial decisions are being made about what to divert resources to, what to cover, what's in the public interest in terms of what is going on in our courtrooms, I think that the reality is that editors in television and radio studios are going to have to make those same judgment calls and put those cases up, and they will get disproportionate levels of coverage.
So won't it then just turn into sensationalism rather than justice, shall we say?
Well, it hasn't in any of the other countries of the world. I mean, I have had the privilege of appearing on television in courts, both in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, a war crimes court where people have had to come along and talk about the most horrendous things that happened in the crimes in Yugoslavia. Women have had to come and talk about forced rape and all of those kinds of issues. And it was an issue that you forget about. You forget about the cameras, and actually the issue that you're focused on is your client and what you want to make as the issue. And I've also appeared in the courts in California, which are televised. And again, the same thing happens. You're not thinking about the camera. You are thinking about what is it that you're going to say. All of your brain, all of your activity is focused towards how are you going to present this case.
Priscilla?
Well, I can see that Mark's got control of what's going on with himself, but you end up, for example, when they started the thing in Scotland, they turned the cameras off, but this woman didn't know it. They were going to deal with another case. She saw the cameras and kind of started going nuts, saying, "Turn that camera on me, let me tell you." And she might have been drunk or something like that. But it was when they were first going to start the televising in Scotland, which they haven't even taken advantage of and done very much. And she just went nuts, and they had said, "We've got to take a break now, sorry." So he's in control, but you end up with all kinds of people in court. I don't know what's going to happen with them.
Well, I think the thing about that, Patricia, is that is that you have the protocol that is operating between the Department of Justice on the one hand and the court service on the other hand, and the television station. And what happens is that ultimately the judge is in charge of the courtroom. Ultimately, the judge has a button and he can kill anything that's coming. So if somebody takes leave of their senses, as this woman obviously did, and that is the minority rather than the majority in all of the cases that I've ever seen around the world and the research I've done, then in those circumstances, the judge just presses the button and the screens go blank.
Just to remind you, you're listening to The Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm asking, should television cameras be allowed to film in court? The Attorney General, Dominic Grieve, QC, has said that this would probably encourage theatricals. Colin, what's your response to that?
I mean, Mark's a responsible lawyer, so I say that because he's a part of this panel, but there are some that are not, and we could see that in many examples. Also in this country as well, whether they're televised or radio broadcast or the like. But we have to remember that there are a number of safeguards in place already. So the introduction of television doesn't cause me concern as a lawyer, because the Attorney General can take contempt proceedings against rogue interventions and journalists who go beyond their remit. So that's not so much a concern. What's probably of more interest to me as a lawyer is the public perception. Priscilla raises it. It's a good point that all of the proceedings should be televised. Now, I disagree with that quite fundamentally, because as a legal principle, the judge will have to decide matters of law. For a jury then to hear that argument defeats the very purpose of that. So I've great sympathy with open justice, transparency, but there really should be part of the television proceedings shouldn't actually cover legal argument. And I think that's quite an important point to emphasise.
Robert, should it cover everything, or should it be restricted?
It needs to be restricted in certain cases. I think it could be much wider than some people anticipate, but I think for people listening to this programme, it's very important that we, as lawyers, identify the fact that different countries and within different countries there are different types of legal case. So, for example, if you have a case that's just being tried by a judge and without a jury, or you have an appeal case which is being tried by judges, no jury, then it's quite easy for proceedings to be publicised in full in television without there being any risk of prejudice to the interests of justice. But when you are dealing with jury cases, they are very different by their very nature. They require restrictions on publicity, which everyone knows which happened now, and television, for those reasons, is bound to be constrained to some extent. So it depends really on the case you're dealing with. But of course, because we're talking about TV, and TV is not just an educational medium, it's an entertainment medium, what everyone would like, and what all the news organisations would like, is to have absolute freedom to look into everything, because then they will get the juicy and the salacious and stuff, the O.J. Simpson type cases rather than the others. So I think one just has to recognise that there's a variety of stuff here, and some of it can easily be broadcast and should be sort of widely investigated and broadcast, whereas some of the other stuff is going to have to be handled with care no matter what we say.
I mean, David, should there be an element of restriction involved?
As your fellow guest said, there's certain things get debated before a case starts before a jury, which, if the jury heard those things, if they were aware of those things, they wouldn't be able to reach a proper verdict. For instance, a defendant might have made a confession which the defence will want to get ruled out, the prosecution will want to get ruled in. If the jury gets to hear about it, it might prejudice them. And so there will have to be some form of restriction on what gets broadcast, because of the need for the overall need for justice to be done to any defendant. But I think that the other concern, I think, is that broadcasters will be looking, as has been said, they'll be looking for the juicy bits. But as I think those of us who spend a lot of time in court know, the juicy bits are few and far between, and in court, in cross-examination and in examination, it's often very careful, very measured, and it's not the drama that people might imagine very, very often. The very effective examination and cross-examination will be very sort of measured questioning, which doesn't have the drama that perhaps some broadcasters might be looking for. And indeed, some viewers might well be very disappointed that a few moments in court that equate to the O.J. Simpson when he tried on the gloves, those dramatic moments that you get in some trials. Very often in other trials, you don't get those dramatic moments, and so people might be disappointed with the what actual trials are like in real life.
If editors are selective over certain trials that they're going to cover more than others, does that not mean that, say for example, the O.J. Simpson case, that people will resort to being slightly more theatrical than if the cameras were switched off?
That's a danger, but as collectively, I mean, I think the lawyers involved are more concerned with winning the case. I mean, they may well get the theatrics, but if they don't win the case, then ultimately that's going to count against them. And I think the judges will come down with a fairly firm hand on any sort of theatrics in court.
Mark?
I think we have to remember that O.J. Simpson was actually an aberrant case. the Chief Justice of California, after the O.J. Simpson case, did a survey and commissioned a study into television in courts in California, because he was as concerned as everyone else was at the behavior of the lawyers and some of the participants in that particular case. And what he came back with was that the judges in California came to the conclusion that this was perhaps a Judge Ito, having lost real control of the courtroom in terms of the camera, or perhaps not having the relevant level of experience to be able to control that issue. But it was an aberrant case, and that the court should presumptively, this is what the judges decided, was that the court should presumptively have cameras in the courts, but that there were more occasions when they would exercise discretion, when they would rule them inadmissible. And I think, we've had this conversation about whether there are cases which will have to be held without cameras. And of course the answer is yes to that. There will be cases involving national security. There'll be cases involving people who are vulnerable, perhaps people who have mental difficulties, or perhaps children. But in relation to the general cases, the basic principle that we have of open justice, which I think was adverted to by Colin earlier, is an issue which is fundamental to the legal system in the UK and has been since Magna Carta. And all we're getting with television is effectively the 21st century version of open justice.
Colin?
Can I continue with Mark's point there? I mean, it's a good point. And looking at North America, for example, Louisiana and other jurisdictions over there have ended up with cases that have gone over to the Supreme Court. One of my concerns is that one case, there was a conviction of a defendant where there'd been a highly emotional confession, something that David mentioned earlier on, had been filmed with the cooperation of the local police. That led eventually to what many would say was a strong evidential case being overturned on appeal. So we've got to be very careful of appellant rights as well. It's not just what happens during a trial, it's what happens thereafter, which then you can go backwards as well and look at the pre-trial publicity as well. So it's pre-trial, during a trial and post-trial in terms of appellant rights as well.
We have at the moment got cameras in one set of courts in England and Wales. Of course, cameras are allowed in Scottish courts already, but in England and Wales we already have them in the Supreme Court, the highest court of appeal, and we have had those courts since its inception a couple of years ago, and not once have we had an issue or problem arising in the appellate court. So I think that we can be reasonably sanguine about the fact that lawyers at that level in the appellate courts are dealing with cases. I think there's a very different issue about news values and whether or not people will want to cover cases which are at the appellate level, because they're about legal points and tend to be unutterably dull to the general public.
But Mark, with that in mind, the appellant courts are very different. I mean, they're very dry in the sense that most of the advocacy there is done on papers. There's no evidence as such with witnesses or victims coming along, whether young or old. It's a very different forum. There's unlikely to be any concerns about televising Supreme Court or appellate level, I'd have thought, anywhere, whether in England or Wales or anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I was approached some years ago to apply to have televised the Lockerbie Bombers trial, and I said, look, it's a Scottish court, and we can make the application, and I think we'll be successful, given it's going to be a case exceptionally heard by Scottish judges in Holland in relation to Libyan defendants about a matter which is of international significance, namely bombing on aeroplanes. But I said, this is going to be an unutterably dull case because it's going to be incredibly slow, because all the evidence will come out through interpreters, at which point the editors decided that wasn't going to be appealing to their viewers and decided not to bother to make the application.
Robert?
I was just going to make a small point that the statistic is, in relation to televisation of the Supreme Court in England, apparently 90,000 people every day watch it, which really surprised me. for something which is obviously so dry and dull. But maybe we're underestimating our potential audience, and there are lots of people there who want to watch TV during the day that are really interested in legal issues and the more intellectual issues. 90,000 I thought was quite impressive.
Just to remind you, this is the Voice of Russia in London. David, I'd like to bring you in here. I mean, Mark raised the kind of the issue of televising certain cases which are of a very high-profile nature. There's been quite a lot of criticism of the Breivik case that's going on at the moment, the fact that it's being televised. I mean, should media attention sometimes just be diverted away from certain types of trials?
Well, one could argue that, but once the sort of the genie's out of the bottle, it's almost impossible to regulate it in that way. It's going to be very difficult to get some sort of unanimity between broadcasters not to cover something like the Breivik trial. And for every argument is saying that, because of the sort of sensitivities and the atrocious crimes committed, there's an argument that says that we have an open justice system, and no matter how monstrous the crime, it makes it even more important that justice be seen to be done. But I think it would be incredibly difficult to argue, once you allow the cameras in, to argue for some sort of system of self-restraint, because I simply don't think that the broadcasters would do that, given the newsworthiness of some of these crimes.
Robert?
Just one thing about Breivik, of course, is an example of a case which is a criminal trial that's not a jury trial. It's an interesting thing. I think they have a mixture there of professional judges who are in charge together with some lay people. So you can have more broadcasts in Norway than you can here, because there's no worry about a jury being prejudiced. But I think what we're going to have to get used to in England in relation to jury trials, if people are going to watch trials and more of it's going to be made available, is that the public will be able to watch the jury trials on TV. They won't get the whole story, but they'll just have to live with it. And there are quite a lot of things like that. If you watch Dragon's Den or some other programmes, you don't really get the whole story. You get a bit of it, and you wonder what's going on behind the scenes. And I think that the good thing is to have jury trials which are broadcast so far as they can be. It will never be 100% because of the risk to preventing a fair trial, but it can be done to a large degree. And as to the 10% they're not allowed to see, they'll kind of understand that, and they'll still watch it.
Mark?
I think Robert makes a very good point there, a very sound point, as one would expect. I think the thing that one should remember, and I think that really picking up on the point about sensational trials, is that I would make the argument that sensational trials all the more should be public and be widely available on television. So if you take Breivik, and the reason I say that is you go back to the very first televised trial, if you like, or filmed trial, which was the Nuremberg trial, and it was absolutely critical that members of the public understood that these people who had behaved inappropriately, had dehumanized a whole raft of the population, got justice. They got a fair hearing. That is what our due process system is about. And it's absolutely critical that we see, that members of the public see, Breivik gets a fair process. And if it is determined that he is criminally insane, people will understand that. And if it is determined that he is criminally responsible and he goes to jail, people will understand that too.
It's important to remember that we do have this distinction between jury-only and judge-only trial. With the jury trials, they would need a firm hand by the judge in control. Where you have Nuremberg and the like and the war crimes tribunals thereafter, it's a point that Robert makes, it's important to have those trials televised and publicised and a greater understanding, whether they be victims or the general public. But there you've got judicial control, which is less of a concern than if you've got televised jury trials.
Priscilla, you've been a court artist for 25 years. Yes. I mean, are you concerned about your job in the future if this goes ahead?
My job has already changed a lot. With budgets being cut and things like that, the companies can't afford to book me as much. And quite often you'll see a reporter just standing outside describing things, and you'll say, well, why can't we see what that looks like?
So finally, is it ever going to be a case of judging each case on its merit? Robert?
I think it will move forward slowly. I think that the judiciary have a very strong hand in this. Judges tend to be conservative, perhaps for good reasons, but also judges are very, very shy of publicity. They don't like it. That's why they like the anonymity of the wigs and the gowns and so on. And that, again, for understandable reasons, perhaps in criminal cases, they don't want their face to be seen by some members of the public. But I think that they will slow the process down. But eventually, I hope that we will get to a situation where we publish absolutely everything that we can without prejudicing the trial, and that will be quite a lot. At the moment, what's going on in Scotland and what's likely to be proposed here when the new legislation is announced in the Queen's speech is a real narrow part of the system, a tiny bit, and I hope we get a big segment as time goes on, but I think it will take time.
Yeah, can I echo that view? As a fellow lawyer and practitioner, there will be certain cases, for example, vulnerable witnesses, either because of age or other infirmity, where it'll be difficult, and national security and public interest cases as well, immunity cases. But like Robert, I do encourage that, but it will be a slow process because we will learn as we go through. Judges have a role to play in controlling the proceedings as well, to ensure there's a right to a fair trial, which is not only for those accused of crime, but the right of the public to have serious allegations tried. So we have to be very careful to look at the potential for adverse publicity pre-trial, during a trial, and pre-appeal as well.
Priscilla?
Well, I think probably if you can deal with it the way you've all discussed, then that sounds a possibility, but I think there are going to be a lot of little mistakes going on, and the courts, as they are now up and down the country, have big problems with even seating people in the court, journalists and myself, for example, to even get a seat, sharing tickets and restricted views and avoiding jury noveling, and it's just tough. But if it could possibly made more like a theater, that might work. People could get a good view, you could see, the camera could get good shots. And it would be nice to see the shots of everyone's faces and some reactions instead of just a locked-off headshot of the judge.
Mark?
Well, I think it is clear. I'm in favour of opening this up as far as is humanly possible, and I think that it is coming. I think the Queen's speech will open it up. I'm not convinced that the Queen's speech will go far enough, but I think it will give confidence and embolden judges to say to future governments, let's go further. And at that point, I think we will see broadcasters acting very responsibly, because they know that this is a privilege and it will be taken away from them if they don't exercise their rights openly and with responsibility.
David?
Yeah, I think this is just the start, and eventually we'll get to a stage where there's a camera in every courtroom and there's a web feed from every courtroom, and I welcome that, because I think as someone who's sat in courts for 25 years reporting on the statements of the lawyers on your panel here, one thing I know is that courts are the best free show in town, and all human life is there. And the sooner we open it up in this way, the better.
Well, unfortunately, we have to finish there. You've been listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Tim Walklate, and today we've been discussing whether television cameras should be allowed to film in court. Joining me in this discussion in the studio was Robert Brown, a partner with the law firm Corker Binning, Colin Wells, a criminal defence specialist at 25 Bedford Row, Priscilla Coleman, who's been ITN's court artist for the past 25 years and is one of only 3 in the country, and joining me on the phone from Sydney, Mark Stevens, a media lawyer and partner with the FSI law firm, and on Skype, David Banks, a media law trainer and co-author of the 18th, 19th and 20th editions of the book McNay's Essential Law for Journalists. Stay tuned, the news is up next.
This is The Voice of Russia. The London Bureau of The Voice of Russia is now live on digital radio and online, with news, comment and debate on weekdays between 4 and 7 p.m.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in the heart of London. I'm Tim Walklate, and today I'm asking, should television cameras be allowed to film in court? practice is common in the United States, and many people expect that in this year's Queen's speech it will be announced that the sentencing of serious offenders in England and Wales will be televised. Filming in England. Mark?
Well, I think that our two lawyers are showing typical British reserve, if I may say. I think that I started off in the same position. Being a lawyer, I was showing typical British reserve. But then I did some research on the subject and actually discovered that we in the United Kingdom are, or in fact in England and Wales, are significantly behind the rest of the world. If you go to other parts of the Commonwealth, for example, India, Australia, New Zealand, they allow cameras into the courtroom. In Canada, it's being increasingly opened up. And of course, our near neighbours in continental Europe, in France, in Germany, and so on and so forth, allow it. So, in fact, in Britain, by not allowing cameras into the courtroom or electronic coverage of courtrooms, so that that would include the not only radio and television, but also perhaps transcripts coming up live.
Limited extent to protect the right to a fair trial. So that would be my initial reaction.
Priscilla?
Well, I think something a little bit probably odd for me. I think you might as well go all the way and televise all the court cases. Because in a way, if you choose one, it's making that court case the star, meaning you maybe think the other court cases are not as important. And you can do a whole war just with mobile phones now. So I think just let everything be open, and if the judge hears it and sees it, then the jury should hear it and see it. And I think that should include the legal argument that the jurors are usually sent out for. Now, I suppose lawyers wouldn't agree with that, but a lot of times when and journalists sit in and hear all the extra things they're talking about, you think, why not just trust the jury completely and say, treat them the way the judge does. Open it all up.
English courts has been banned since 1925, but this ban is expected to be lifted to aid the concept of open justice and allow the public to engage with the justice system. The government has said that filming would improve transparency and public understanding of the courts. Last Wednesday, the life sentencing of the murderer David Gilroy was filmed in Scotland's High Court in Edinburgh, after all the parties involved gave their consent. However, it's believed that broadcasts will be strictly limited, with only the sentencing and judges summing up at the end of the cases being televised. I'm joined in the studio today by Robert Brown, a partner at the law firm Corker Binning, Colin Wells, a criminal defence specialist at 25 Bedford Row, Priscilla Coleman, who's been ITN's court artist for the past 25 years and is one of only 3 in the country. And joining me on the phone from Sydney is Mark Stevens, a media lawyer and partner at the FSI law firm. And on Skype is David Banks, a media law trainer and co-author of the 18th, 19th and 20th editions of the book McNay's Essential Law for Journalists. Thank you all for coming. Now, I'd first like to ask you all very briefly, should television cameras be allowed to film in court? Robert?
Very briefly, the answer is yes, because the technology is there and it's good that people can see what's going on in courts. But a big caveat, what will be allowed to be filmed will be so limited that it's not going to create a revolution in understanding of the justice system.
Colin?
Can I agree with that? As a fellow lawyer, open justice is to be encouraged for all. As an educational tool, it's of great public interest that the general public sees what's actually going on, so there's transparency in proceedings, whether they be civil or probably more of interest criminal as well. But as Robert said, the actual proceedings that are covered will be of such